Welcome, everybody. Good evening and good morning to our American guests. Welcome to this online talk, Why Science Needs Story, which is part of the SciComm Academy, a new initiative by the Brussels-based organization SciMingo, which you might know from our other projects such as PhD Cup, Scriptieprijs, or Science Figured Out. With our new project, we want to encourage scientists to share their research with the world and guide them in this process. For this, we organize hands-on trainings on writing, infographics, podcasting, and video and pitching. Especially this last course, in which we learn researchers how to explain what they do in front of the camera, might be of interest to you, as this resonates with a lot of the things Randy will talk about tonight, or at least I expect that this will resonate with what he has to say. If you want to enroll for one of our courses, you better hurry, because there are only a few spots left for our trainings this fall. In addition to our trainings, we also organize online talks like this evening, in which experienced science communicators and journalists share their tips and tricks. You may discover our complete program at www.scicommacademy.eu. I will type this in the chat box later. Now, I am very happy to introduce you to Randy Olson. He is a marine biologist turned filmmaker who was a tenured professor at the University of New Hampshire before changing careers by moving to Hollywood and entering film school. He has written a number of short films and feature documentaries addressing major scientific issues such as the decline of the world's oceans and global warming. He has also published a number of excellent books on science communication, including Houston, We Have a Narrative in 2015 and Narrative is Everything in 2019. Apparently, he thinks narrative is very important. Today, Randy will teach you how to turn the dull into the dramatic, something which in his view is just easy as ABT. In a nutshell, his ABT approach introduces momentum, conflict, and resolution, the fundamental building blocks of story. On a practical note, this lecture consists of 3 parts. Randy will first explain his ABT approach. Then we will do a short exercise. And lastly, there is room for questions, both from myself and from the wider audience. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat already during the talk, or remember them and virtually raise your hand afterwards when I may allow you to share your microphone and video. But first, let's listen to our guest. Randy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tina. And you may live to regret having brought me here as a guest by the time we get done with your ABT and our ABT workshop exercise. No, actually, I promise to be very gentle with the work that we do on it. So greetings, SciMingoers. Thank you very much for this invitation to come share a little bit of time with you and talk about the wonderful ABT framework. Let's hope that I present a few things here that make a little bit of sense to you. It's a very big concept that starts off very simple with the 3 words, but therefore we're going to get into it in lots of depth. And let's get started here. So I'm going to tell you about the course that we run now, because that's the heart and soul of the whole developing body of knowledge around the ABT framework. And one of the things I like to say at the start of the course is it's usually 30 participants that do the 10 one-hour sessions. And I tell everybody, you've entered here and you are all beautiful narrative seedlings. You're just starting to develop your narrative skills. And you all hope that by the time you're done with this course, you are going to be beautiful narrative trees. But the bad news is your first ABT is actually, by the time you finish the 10 one-hour sessions, you're going to be mere saplings. You'll be better than a seedling, but it's up to you to get out in the real world and work on this stuff. I'm going to tell you some more details about that, but building narrative intuition is the goal of all this sort of stuff. And what we mean by that is the idea of not just knowing the rules of narrative, but actually absorbing them at such a level that it's intuitive, where you can actually feel the forces at work and you can sense how to shape things. And we'll talk some more about that in a minute. But what we're going to do here at the start is I'm going to tell you 2 stories, starting with the great leopard seal encounter. So here we go. fun little story about once upon a time back when I was a marine biologist, and I was lucky enough to get to spend a month in Antarctica at the McMurdo Research Station run by the United States with about 1,500 scientists down there during the summertime. I was there for only a month, was studying starfish. This is a long time ago, and there was a group down there that had been studying starfish and their larvae brought me down there for the month. They'd been there for a year, and we went scuba diving almost every day through the ice pack around the Ross Island where the base is located. They go out and drill holes through the ice, and you slide down through this 12-foot cylinder and come out on the bottom under that, and then you dive down the bottom, and it's the clearest water on earth. It's a spectacular experience. But in the last few days there, they gave us an extra little treat, which was they gave us one day of crew with the helicopter to take us over the other side of the island where we could go diving, where the ice breaks up and you can actually just jump into the open ocean over there. So that's what we did. It was a beautiful sunny day. These were my two dive partners. The temperature was 20 degrees, but we'd been at minus 20 for the past week or so. And so when you get outside and it's sunny and it's only 20 degrees, it feels like it's summertime. And this is the place that we found to get into the water. So the edge of the island right there goes over, and there's a little ice ledge and about a 5-foot drop down from the ice to the water. Seemed like a good place. We had a couple ropes that we kind of put in there so we could just lower ourselves down with that. Began gearing up for the big dive. And this is me in the dark glasses. To my left is Ron Britton, the red beard, who's a wild man, had been, and then behind me is Sid Bosch, the other dive partner. The two of them had been there for a year, so they knew lots and lots about Antarctica. And again, I'd only been there for really about 3 weeks at the time of this day when we went diving. And you notice these are our dry suits that we used, and there's the double scuba tanks. So as we were over there at the edge of the ice, gearing up and kind of attending to the last details for jumping off to get in the water, I was kind of bent over working on my scuba tank there, adjusting some knobs on it. And I heard Sid, the guy in the background there, say, "Oh my goodness." And I looked up and saw he was looking down at the water. And when I looked down at what he was looking at, it was a leopard seal. And I had no idea what a leopard seal was. I grew up in Kansas in the middle of the United States, did not have any background experience with leopard seals. But the two guys began filling me in on why this was significant, that there was a leopard seal just 5 feet away from us, looking straight up, waiting for us to jump in the water and join him, which is that leopard seals feed on these little black creatures, and they swim up and chomp them like that. And they have great big canine teeth. You can see there. There's a skull of you can notice it says sub-adult, and look at how big those canines are. And adults can get to be this size, 800 to 1,000 pounds. The head, look at how large the head is just compared to that scuba diver there. Notice that the scuba diver is also black, just like a penguin, maybe a little larger than penguin, but I'm not sure the eyesight of a leopard seal is that great. So there was reason for concern. And again, the head of that creature is enormous. Just looking down at it is very impressive. So what to do? We stood there looking down at this leopard seal that was just staring at us, waiting for us to jump off the edge of the ice. The other two guys that were with us there off to the right, they walked down about a quarter mile down the coast, and they found a place where the ice came all the way right down to the water's edge. There's about a 6-inch height difference down there. So we decided we could take all the gear down there and get in there. And that way, if anything went wrong, the guys on the shore could just grab us by the arms and pull us out immediately. So we did that, trudged all the way down there, got all the gear back on, geared up. The guy with the red beard was gung-ho. He said, "These things are more afraid of us than we are of them. As soon as we get in there, splash around, we'll never see that leopard seal again." The other fellow, Sid, was far less bold, and he was saying, "I've read about them. They can get really aggressive." So we finally resolved the debate by telling Ron that, "You're so gung-ho, you're going to be the first one to get in." So he went over and sat on the edge of the ledge as we were all gearing up as well, and just put his fins on, swung his legs over, and was looking back at us, adjusting his mask. And honest to goodness, I have him come every so often to my course and tell the story himself so that everybody knows that it's not me exaggerating, because just as he was adjusting his mask, he said to us, "No pain, no gain." And right at that instant, the leopard seal's head surfaced between his legs. All I remember was flipping over on my belly and scratching the ice to get away from it till I got about 10 or 15 feet back. When I rolled back over, I looked over and there was Ron back about 10 feet from the ice edge, laying on his back, massaging his chest, trying to keep his heart going, hyperventilating. It was just utterly terrifying to have this enormous monster surface between his legs. We were all screaming and yelling, and I managed to grab my camera and get this one photo of the beast. And there you can see it. That's its head right there next to the ice. It never tried to bite him, never did anything aggressive, just seemed to be nothing more than curious, wanted to be part of the party and surface between his legs. Suffice it to say, it was terrifying enough for us that was the end of our scuba diving venture that day at the ice edge. We took off all the gear, walked down the coast, spent the afternoon taking photographs of this emperor penguin colony, and eventually built ourselves a little snow hut as we waited about 2 or 3 more hours for the helicopter to come back and pick us up. So it was a wonderful day. And now you're wondering, why have I eaten up a chunk of your time telling you this crazy leopard seal story? Well, now it's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. So let me now review that story much more quickly, more condensed, to tell you that what the story basically was about was we were at the ice edge and set to dive, but leopard seal surfaced. Therefore, we moved down the coast. But as we prepared to dive, it surfaced between Ron's legs. Therefore, we spent the day photographing penguins. That's the basic story of what I told you. Now, this is all stripped down. By the way, Tina, what did you say to me about your ABT when I chopped it down like that and I brought it down to the base? You said, "Oh, I guess it drains it of all the character." That's what we've just done here. This is boiling it down to the basic story points, which is what you do for doing narrative analysis. Now, more importantly, let's start to dive into looking at the 2 elements that make up communication. So first off, you have your content. This is the information you're wanting to communicate to an audience, all the white words there. And then you have your form. And these are the key words that help you shape the form of how you put it all together. The problem is content is relatively easy for all of you. You're experts in your field. And when I set to work working with people like yourselves, I just say, I can't help you at all with your content. I don't know your field of expertise, and I'm not interested in your field of expertise. Telling me a bunch of details of what you do just clogs up my brain. My only expertise is in the form stuff, but it turns out form is much more difficult. It takes a lot of time, and you never totally get it right. It's very subjective, but that's what we're here to talk about. And so we take away the content, and you see, this is the starting point here, is to realize these 3 words provide enough of the form to structure how you want to present your information. And so then it becomes a challenge of organizing and reorganizing. I like to call it information structuring. Sometimes you're just putting the information together in the right sequence so people can absorb it properly and understand it. And the fact is, if you don't put it together the right way, people can end up with your information, even though your information is accurate and correct, they can get it all wrong. I'm going to tell you about a case study in that in a short while. And so I've just used this structure, the and but therefore structure, to tell you that crazy little anecdote about encountering a leopard seal. Now let me show you in the nonfiction world. My area of study as a scientist was marine ecology, the study of the distribution and abundance of organisms. And we can use the same structure to give you a super brief history of this field of science. And if anybody's an ecologist, you'll know this is extremely butchered on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's pretty accurate, which is the formal study of marine ecology, trying to explain the distribution and abundance of organisms, began in the 1900s. And in the beginning, there was a focus mostly on physiology as the determining factor. But by the 1960s, there began to be this new interest in interspecific interactions, competition, predation, things of that sort, which therefore gave rise to an entirely new way to study ecology, experimental ecology, going out and manipulating ecosystems and environments and populations. But by the 1980s, there was a little bit of a sentiment developing that some of that stuff had gotten a little too carried away in the theoretical direction. Therefore, as a result of that, there's a little bit of a shift back to physical factors. So there's the narrative, there's the story, the series of events occurring in the search for the solution to understanding distribution, abundance of marine organisms, told to you with that same structure. Now, one more example of using the same structure, we can apply it directly to the telling of big and wonderful stories that appeal to masses of the sort that Hollywood makes. So, for example, I could tell you the story of a little girl named Dorothy Gale who has a dog named Toto, and she lives a relatively boring life on a farm in Kansas. But then one day, a tornado comes along and picks up her and her dog and her house and takes them to the land of Oz. And she gets there. but she wants to find her way back home. Therefore, she's told she should team up with these three characters and follow the yellow brick road to take them to the mighty Wizard of Oz, who can help her get back home. And so they get to the Wizard of Oz, but no sooner do they get there than he says, I'm not going to help you until you bring me the broom of the Wicked Witch of the West. And therefore, they have to sneak into the castle of the Wicked Witch of the West and steal the broom. And the story goes on and on, just a sequence of ands, buts, and therefores. That's how you tell a story. That's how we do all this narrative stuff, ands, buts, and therefores, on and on and on. And so this is the course that we've developed over the past year and a half. I published my book, Houston, We Have a Narrative, in 2015, and in there described this idea of narrative training. So we had a first version of that went for 5 years called Story Circles Narrative Training. That was fun and popular, and we ran it with a bunch of government agencies, in particular, and National Park Service especially. And we were kind of like clicking along full steam, and then the pandemic hit last year. I took a break for a couple months, and then we started to say among ourselves, what about this Zoom thing? You think that's going to be feasible to actually teach a course through Zoom? So we announced the idea of a course on a Monday, and by the Friday, it filled all 50 slots. To our surprise, like, wow, we didn't realize this many people were sitting here ready to jump into Zoom, and people were looking for anything. So we ran the first round a year ago, this past April, and it was so popular that we're now in the 17th round, and it just kind of has been off and running. Every month we run another round of it. In the beginning, it was 50 participants. Now we've kind of whittled it down to just 30. And what the course consists of is 10 one-hour sessions. Each hour session has two parts to it. It has kind of the one directional thing of me giving a lecture like this. And then the second half of the hour is this unique exercise I've developed called the ABT build. And we're going to do a couple of them just to give you a feel for how that works. And so that's the interactive part. So the hour is broken into two halves. First half is all lecture, and the second half is interacting with the people and their individual ABTs. We'll get into that. Here's the course now. Let's see, September, we are in the thick of this fisheries course. Tomorrow will be the fourth session in that. Next month, we've already got it booked with Smithsonian and NOAA and National Park Service. And then it's booked all the way into next spring. So it's really turned out to be very fun, popular, and effective for folks as they begin to apply this ABT framework to what they're doing. Now, let me tell you another little story here in a larger scale, and I'm calling this a brief history of thought in 3 chapters. And so history of thought in 3 chapters, and this is the biggest picture of all to get you to understand why I feel that the ABT framework is an important, significant element. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, we humans communicated more effectively than we do today. This is the point that's not being talked about, and it's tragic. We have gone from a world where people had relatively clear minds. There wasn't that much information, and we know from looking back at some of the writings that the communication was a lot better. In the 1600s and 1700s, the great philosophers like Kant and Hegel identified this 3-part structure. That's basically how the brain is programmed. These 3 parts: thesis, antithesis, synthesis is what they identified it as, the triad. It's really as fundamental as setup, problem, solution, beginning, middle, and an end, on and on and on. It's this 3-part structure. This is how we are programmed at the simplest of all levels. And I think it goes deeper than humans. I think that every creature has got this programmed into their synapses, their ganglia, or whatever it is. Every lizard that goes out of its burrow in the morning is got a setup, which is its stomach is empty. It's got a problem, which is it needs to feed, and then it works on finding a solution, going after some prey. And I'm willing to bet that when the day finally comes that we decode all this communication among birds and whales and all these different species we know are communicating all day long, I guarantee you the vast majority of what they're talking about is simple problem solution dynamics. They are telling each other about, man, I was hungry this morning and I went out and I, found this one thing that I fed on and it was wonderful. And that's how we operate, problem solution dynamics. Why wouldn't that be at the core of everything that we do? And getting back to what Tina said in the introduction there, I do believe that narrative is everything. And I'll say a few words about that in a minute. So that was chapter 1, where the thinking was clear. Chapter 2, sadly, is obfuscation, the 1900s. And 1975, there was this short paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine titled medical obfuscation, structure and function. What the author did was took one issue of the journal, picked out 3 papers, read through them, and put together kind of a top 10 list of the 10 recurring characteristics of the style of writing that led to this problem of obfuscation. That word just means basically taking something that is not that complicated, but explaining it in a manner that is so complicated that you just can't make any sense out of it. And that's really bad news. It's the enemy of effective communication, obfuscation. This was such a brilliant paper. It's been lost to the ravages of time. It's only been cited, as far as I can tell, about 80 times in 40 years. But in the short discussion at the end of it, the author said, contrary to popular belief, there's little historical precedent for bad writing. And this is important because people have a tendency to say, oh, particularly with scientists, oh, scientists, they've always been terrible at communication. No, they haven't. That's what the author is saying. 100 years ago, scientific prose is usually said to begin with Galileo. The Starry Messenger is a classic of vigorous exposition. Even as late as the 19th century, physicians stated their views with strength and conviction. Only in the 20th century has obfuscation become widely acceptable. There's your fundamental problem, is all these organizations, all these groups, all these institutes just sitting there wallowing in obfuscation and not deeming it to be a problem to get to work on. Now, here's a more specific example of what I'm talking about here is the IPCC. Hopefully most of you know about that, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Most important body in the world, coming together every few years to try and figure out what in the world is going wrong with our climate. And with every one of their major reports that they release every 2 to 4 years, along with it is this shorter little section called the Summary for Policymakers, or SPM. And that is intended to be the translation for the broader audience of the big fat report that is unreadable. The idea of that is that it's written in language so simple and plain that anybody, or especially politicians, can read it and make sense of it. So my good friend, John Sturman, who I just had as a guest on my podcast last week, in 2008, published this wonderful, again, short paper in Science. And what he reported on was a very simple experiment he did. He took 200 and some graduate students at MIT in science and math and gave them the Summary for Policymakers from the previous year's IPCC report, asked them to read through the few paragraphs and then regurgitate it back in 2 to 3 sentences, just saying, what did this basically say in terms of the science? When he read over what they wrote back, 84% of these graduate students at MIT in math and sciences got it wrong. Even they couldn't make sense out of what was in this supposed statement for the general public. In his paper, this is one of the paragraphs, John said, first, the SPM is far too technical to change people's mental models. The IPCC should issue its findings in plain language. Second, clarity, while necessary, is not sufficient. When common sense and science conflict, people often reject the science. That last sentence is so important. That tells a lot about what's gone on in the past year and a half here with the pandemic. When common sense and science conflict, people often reject the science. That's a huge problem. Furthermore, you might have hoped in 2008 when he published his little paper that everybody got to work like, we got to fix this, but no, nothing of the sort happened. 2015, writer at Nature did his own little study using the Fleisch reading ease score and showed that since the early 90s, when these SPMs first started being produced, the trend is straight downhill. They've gotten more and more difficult to read. And then last week when I had John on my podcast, I said, and how's it today? He said, worse than ever. So look at what's happening. We're gathering all this knowledge and the communication is getting worse. How in the world can that be going on? And why is it not held up as a major problem? So here's the punchline on this paper and why it's so important, and why I am determined, mark my words, I am going to continue for probably the rest of time touting this paper until I can finally, hopefully, be heard by the top people in the science world who generally tend to ignore me because they don't like to be criticized. But here's who the author was of that paper. Michael Crichton. He wrote it as one of the last things he did in the biomedical world before leaving and going off to Hollywood, and among many things, writing the novel Jurassic Park and a whole series of techno thrillers. By 1994, he became the first person ever to have simultaneously the #1 movie, the #1 book, and the #1 television show. He dominated Hollywood. And as a result, he had gone the full distance as a biomedical researcher. He'd done his medical school at Harvard and his residency at Mass General. He was an incredibly bright guy in 2 disciplines, both in science and in media. And he wasn't just a wannabe in Hollywood. He dominated Hollywood. He was the #1 force there for communication. As a result, he was so knowledgeable. And tragically, as he tried for 25 years to reach back to the science world and share some of that knowledge, he was largely ignored. This paper, as I said, cited only 80 sometimes, and mostly just seen as some clown from Hollywood. That's what the academic science world has a tendency to do. So chapter 3, return to clarity. And this is where now we talk about this ABT framework. And what I believe is something that needs to be pushed for is this simple tool to try and boil things down, to find the core of simplicity, to combat obfuscation, to try and fight against the tendency to just complicate everything endlessly. It's okay eventually to reach some complexity, but the fact is narrative has a fractal dimension to it. And what fractals mean is that out of simplicity, you can create complexity, but you want to begin with that simplicity and radiate outwards on that. That's what the ABT is about. It's basically the fractal unit, this 3-part structure that is how we communicate. And what the narrative gym concept is, I'll tell you about in a minute, but it's the idea that we've developed in the course. And this is really my life's mission now, is what I'm telling everybody, building Mount ABT, because the science world is almost impenetrable. I've published 6 books now on science communication, and it seems like the further I go with what I'm producing, the less the science world wants to hear about they don't want to talk about this fundamental problem of being really weak on communication. And yet there's lots of people, especially in the government agencies, that are eager to improve their communication skills. And that's where we're really thriving with the course that we do. In the course, I developed, well, actually in my Houston book, way back then, I learned this from the improv folks that I've worked with for 20 years in Hollywood. They like to talk about improv being, figuratively speaking, like a muscle. It's like you have an improv muscle in your body. And if you want to be good as an improv actor, you've got to condition that muscle. You've got to get it into shape, and then you got to keep it in shape. You can't, an improv actor cannot expect to stand up on the stage having not done improv for a year and give a good performance. Just like an athlete, just like a musician, you've got to get into shape and stay in shape. So we adopted the same sort of principle for narrative, which is the narrative part of your brain is like a muscle. You've got to get it into shape. You've got to condition it over time. And it takes a lot of effort, and there is a payback eventually. But if you think that you're going to take a 1 afternoon workshop once a year at your scientific meeting and somehow instantly become brilliant at it, that ain't going to happen. And that's a little bit of the warning with this presentation here, is I'm giving you some tidbits, but this stuff takes lots of time. So as a result, one of the elements that we've added on to the course is what we call working circles. And so that's a separate kind of extra activity that goes on for all the people, the 30 people in the course. And what a working circle is 5 people getting together for a half an hour with one person presenting their ABT, their narrative. So 5 individuals, half hour. One person is the host with their ABT. They get it to everybody before you start. And then we kind of got a set little agenda of what you work on to help this person do exactly what I'll be doing in a few minutes when we do this ABT exercise. Take the ABT and begin to poke and prod it with the interest of making it stronger, to help the person, not to just cut it down like, oh, well, that one's boring. That's the nice thing with the ABT framework, is that it gives you these analytical tools to go to work to help the person. And the person wants to hear, and you've got the ability to argue the reason your thing is bogging down here, the reason it's a little boring is, look, you've gone on too long with your and segment. You've got to yada, yada. And so all these things, it gives you actual criteria to explain it. And then another part of it, so the ABT framework then is not just the course, it's that working circles that they're all required to do. They have to host one and participate in 2. And then when they finish the course, they go into a big Google group. We've got about 250 or 300 graduates now in there, and they're welcome to come back and redo working circles, either take part as a participant or even run their own. So it becomes this big viable resource for everybody to be working, because you cannot develop this narrative stuff on your own at your desk thinking to yourself. You've got to have other human beings that you're working with as a group. All writers know this. This is why they have writers groups. You've got to bounce it off other people, and their brains help you shape the narrative. And then another element to all this is the weekly podcast that we've developed now. This week, we're taking a little holiday for the first time. We've done 22 episodes, but every episode I have on people that are related to narrative structure, and we talk about the ABT and apply it. So it's another chance to activate the narrative part of your brain. Last week, as I said, I had Dr. John Sturman to come on, and it was wonderful talking about his climate interactive model. Next week, I'm having 2 actor buddies of mine that are major veteran actors that are total characters. Week after that, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have 2 psychologists that are also friends that are big fans of the ABT. So on and on. And then with the course, as I say, it's got to be more than just one person working by themselves. These are the 15 or so folks that are the team that work with me. 5 of them give 5 of the sessions. I give the first 4, and then I give the last one, and the others join in and are present there for the sessions. And so it's really a major group effort. The social element is so important. And so towards that end, it is time now to give you a tiny little sample here of the interactive part of this process. And this is something I began developing probably 7 or 8 years ago in the Story Circles course, in which we would do it live, and I would have people read their ABT, and I would, off the top of my head, kind of critique it. But with time, I came to realize it's actually benefits if I can get the ABT a day in advance and really make a few notes to kind of get more specifically and to the core of what we're working on. So towards that end, I asked Tina to find 2 brave volunteers. The first of whom is Peter Jan Verhelst. Am I pronouncing it right? There you are.
Yeah, yes, basically.
Peter Jan, how do I say it?
It's Peter Jan.
Peter Jan, okay, good enough. All right, cool. Great to meet you. And where are you located right this moment?
I'm located in Belgium, in the village, it's called Wevelgem, near the city of Kortrijk.
Wonderful. All righty.
Yeah.
I was telling Tina earlier that the funny thing is your ABT here, I feel like I'm right in the course right now. The current round of the course is with 30 fisheries biologists. And this is identical. This is the same type of ABTs that we get every single day. So when I looked at it, like, is this a mistake? Is this from out of our course or no? So that's pretty funny. And it's great. So let us go to work on this. And the way we like to do this is we begin by having you just read it to the whole group. As you read it, I will click the button and advance it. And we color code the 3 parts of the ABT. Blue for the opening, the and material, that's your agreement. You're setting up the problem. Red is the problem. And then green is the therefore for the consequence. So you'll see as we go along, I'll advance that. So on that note, how about if you just read this to us?
Okay. So the European eel is a critically endangered fish species that travels an incredible journey throughout its life. And it grows in freshwater like rivers and migrates to the Atlantic Ocean to spawn. But the exact location is unknown, impeding eel conservation. Therefore, we track them via tracking devices called data loggers. These devices measure temperature and depth and are externally attached to the eel. After some time, the data loggers come off the eel, drift to the sea surface, wash ashore, and are hopefully found by beachgoers. A €50 reward is given when they retrieve the tag, so we can download the data and reconstruct the eel's trajectory.
Wonderful. Okay, and this is great. And now what we're going to work on is strengthening this. So everybody can see, I don't think anybody got lost there. Nobody got confused. Nobody got bored. It's good. It's just that there are some ways to add a little bit more punch to it that makes it a bit more compelling. And your goal with these ABTs, you've got 2 main factors you're trying to work, and they work against each other. So you want to make it as short and concise as possible because there is strength in communicating in short, punchy sentences or whatever. But you make it too short, then you've chopped out all the information and it's no longer compelling. It's like, yeah, that was great, but you didn't tell us anything. So you need to retain that. So you end up with this battle back and forth to try and optimize it. First question I like to ask on these ABTs, this is kind of the standard procedure, is the term I use for it is what's the main character. And what I like to say is that if I ran into you yesterday on the street and said, hey, what's your ABT going to be about tomorrow? And in 2 to 3 words, can you tell me what's your ABT about, basically?
Eel migration.
It's about that, but what's the challenge that what's the problem? What's the core of about that we're really, it's a study of what?
Yeah, the unknown eel migration routes.
That's better. Yeah, something like that. Let's see. Here's what I just plucking a couple words out of your narrative there is, so, what's this about? This is about how we need to know the exact location for spawning, something like that. And so it's more, yeah, it's about eels, but this is really the process is that we can't manage these things if we don't know this one central thing. So it's about exact location for spawning. So it's about spawning location, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think that's sort of the operative words right there. So it's important to just know to yourself in just 2 or 3 words what's the core story that you're telling here. It's a story about the importance of that. What's the problem that you're working on here in 5 words or less? And this really has to be 5 words or less. What's the problem? And actually, you could begin the sentence by saying the problem is. Then I'll give you 5 words.
The problem is the spawning location is unknown.
Yeah, I think something like that. Don't know where they spawn, in simple terms. So that's it. So this is super duper important. And this is where the interesting thing is that this process of strengthening your ABT doesn't begin by starting it on that blue material. You don't know what needs to be in the blue material until you know the problem. So you need to jump right to the B, the middle of the ABT structure, and go to work on finding what's the problem. And not only that, boiling it down to what's the central overarching core problem that we're working on. And you wouldn't believe how many times we get these people in this training program, some of whom have got $1 million grants, big projects they're running. And we start with this initial thing. So what's the problem? And the next thing you know, they're kind of casting about, well, it's kind of this and it's kind of that. And actually, there's about 4 different problems we're working on. That's not good. You really want to know in simple terms, crystal clear in your mind, what's the problem you're working on? At the core, the main thing we're working on here is just we need to know where they spawn. We can't manage these things if we don't know where they spawn. Everything is just going to be a mess if you don't know where they spawn. That's the sort of argument you want to be putting forward. So we don't know where they spawn. So that's great. We're nice, clear narrative we got here. Now, here's one of the many tools. And this is the problem here is, that I'm doing this with you folks just to have some fun. But I just got to warn you over and over again, you're getting very little out of this 1-hour session because it just takes a long time to slowly absorb this stuff. That's why the course is 10 1-hour sessions. We do it Tuesday, Thursdays. And once upon a time, we had one group that made a mess out of the whole thing and took them forever to get through. They had so many people couldn't make in their timing. And I asked them at some point, what if we did this whole thing in 1 week? We went through all 10 1-hour sessions and they just recoiled and said, no. You need time between these sessions to absorb narrative and think it through. It is such a deep thing. It is at the core of everything you do. And it just takes time to really get this. How do I know so much about that? Because I went to film school at the University of Southern California in the mid 90s. And they told us from day one, this narrative structure, it's the be all and end all. And I was 38 years old and the scientist, and I just kind of poo-pooed that. Yeah, well, that's one of many things that's important. It took me 10 to 15 years to slowly begin to realize what they're talking about. Oh my God, none of this stuff works if you don't have the narrative structure right. And getting the narrative structure right takes a lot of time and effort. So that said, the ABT is just a framework. That's the term we use. And it means that it's this structure that you can then start to hang other things on it. And it gives you the places to hang these things. And this is one of the coolest ones we've come across in just the past year, that we're making all this stuff up as we go along. There's never been an ABT framework. But here's what we suddenly came to realize was this clause of if then, which is really common in logic and in computer language, things like that. It turns out it's really powerful in this narrative stuff, especially, for example, if you're writing a proposal. And there's 2 ways you can use the if then clause. You can use it in your setup. And this explains to people why this is important, what you're doing. And the way you use it is you say, if we do this thing, if we figure out the spawning location, then, and so actually, can you give me a shot at that right now? So why do we care about the spawning location? And your answer back is, look, if we figure out the spawning location, then what can you do?
We can make conservation better.
Can you get more specific than that? Exactly.
Yeah.
You can make the world a better place. Let's say, we can only designate so much of a river as completely protected. If we know the spawning location, that's the most vulnerable spot. And that, given our limitations, we can pinpoint that as the one place we're going to cash in all our chips there and say, nobody go to this one place. So, you could say, if we figure out the spawning location, then we can work strategically in terms of
and
what we protect. So that's the kind of stuff that helps you make the argument when people are trying to decide whether to give you money for funding. That's what's clearest in their mind. Look, if we give you all this money, what are you going to do with it? You know, who cares if the spawning location? Then you come back with, well, you give me that money, and if we can figure out these spawning locations, then this is all the stuff. You're going to save us all this other resources by being able to work strategically, blah, blah, blah. That's the power of the if-then tool. And then you can also use the if-then tool in the red material in the opposite direction, which is basically fear-based messaging, in which you say, but we don't know the spawning location. And if we don't figure out the spawning location of the species in the next 3 years, studies are showing it's going to go extinct because we're losing blah, 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 blah. So you use the if-then there as a consequence of why this is so important. If we don't act now, then we're going to lose everything. These are judgments for you to make, but these are add-ons that you can add on to the ABT structure. So now we go back to your ABT that you had there. And let me show you my shot at a revision on it, and know that you can't solve this thing in one day. What you do then is you take this and you pull together a working circle with 4 other people that are trained in this whole thing. Together, you work for half an hour time slot, and you maybe do another round 2 weeks later. The same people come together, and over time you iterate it. And then if you're like me, you go out surfing and you sit out there on your surfboard in the ocean for an hour straight, in between these waves that you're waiting for them, and you think and you think and you think, and all of a sudden while you're out there, you go, oh my God, I got it. Wait a second, this piece is in the wrong place. You know, it's in the, therefore it should have been in the up front. And it's a puzzle solving exercise, but each time you solve one of the pieces of the puzzle, it's really fun. And you paddle back into the shore like, I got to go home right now, write down what I'm thinking about. It's the thinking, and then ideally working with other people. So towards that end, here's a quick shot at, you know, my take on the thing, how I rewrite it, maybe something along the lines of, what you want to begin with is, before we even get into what we're talking about, your project, you want to give us the context, the basic principle of why this stuff, what this stuff is and why it's important. So starting off with something, one of the terms we like to use is we know this. Okay, here's what we know. We know that a thorough knowledge of spawning habitats is an essential element for management of a migratory species like the European eel. And if we can gather this information, then what we just talked about there, then we can work strategically or whatever the benefit is there. So you set it all up, and the blue material ends up being nothing to do with the problem. It's just all the happy, joyful, this is how great we can make the world. And you get to the end of the blue material and we're ready to celebrate. It feels like the whole story's over with. Then you keep going and ruin everything with the word but. And that's when everybody's brains get activated. You know, you had us in happy land. Oh my God, you know, this is great. And then, but here's the bad news. The exact location is unknown. And that's just, you know, impeding eel conservation. We can't work strategically if we don't know where this thing is, something like that. So you drop the bomb in the red material, and then you move onward to exact location unknown, impeding eel conservation. Therefore, and now you tell us the actions, and you've got it there. You could probably trim down a little bit what you've got there for the actions. But notice that what happens here is that once you get the red material, that guides you backwards into what you want to have in that blue material. And we didn't need to know a lot of things you've got up there. The travel's an incredible journey throughout its life. That's interesting, but that's extraneous to the argument we're trying to put together here. That's just like extra information. Grows in freshwater rivers, migrates to the Atlantic Ocean. That's all. That's not real crucial. Suffice it to say that, you know, we just need to, it's a migratory species we need to manage. And you use the red material that gives you your marching orders of what to put in the blue, and you want to keep the blue to the bare minimum, because every piece of information, every other word you add to the blue is bogging things down. You're losing the strength of it. You're slowing the process down. But if you can get it really efficient like that, then people are right in there. And then once you set up the problem, then they're willing to let you go on and on with your green material. There is pretty good. You know, once we really want to know how exactly are you going to solve this, and now we're willing to sit there for a long time and listen to all the details. It's interesting because you've motivated us. Is that making some sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Okie doke. All right. So that's one. And now, Tina, time for the other one. And I hope I put this together properly. Thank you very much there, Peter Jan. And
yeah, thank you for the tips.
Okay, you betcha. Then Tina, here we go with yours.
Yeah.
And
Thanks.
I always like to ask people where they're located exactly. Where you told me before, where are you located?
I'm located in Leuven. Not too far from Brussels, but nothing is too far from Brussels in Belgium.
Exactly. Okay, great. Okay, so let's do the same thing. How about if you read this to us and then we'll go to work on it.
Yeah, so donor insemination has appealed to the human imagination for centuries and has given rise to controversy. But in fact, hardly anyone really knows how the sperm bank used to work because everything was done in the greatest secrecy. Therefore, I am writing the first book on the history of the sperm bank based on interviews with people who have never spoken about their experiences before.
Okay, wonderful. So she sent me a first draft that was very lengthy and had all kinds of cool.
I sent you the draft, which actually got me a book contract.
Oh, geez. All right. Well, this makes me look
but
bad.
it was a lot longer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's good because what the ABT is meant to be is a single sentence that's at the core of the whole thing. And then what you had sent me was the expanded version out. And that's the way you want to go about doing this stuff. You want to first figure out that simple core of the ABT. Then once you've got it, then it's easy to add on all those details. And what that means is it guarantees that you've got this proper narrative structure. And that's crucial. You know, people will follow along. So I know it was heartbreaking to have me force you strip out all the information, the interesting stuff there. But does it make some sense to you now as to what you've got here?
Because, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Because I think everybody followed this. It's short, it's concise, it's punchy. We get what your setup is basically. We get the problem that you're addressing there. And then we get the solution. Your solution is you're going to write a book about this thing. Now let's dig deeper into this. Main character, same thing. What is this about basically? In one word, can you pick one word that is kind of cool that summarizes what this whole narrative is about?
One word.
Yeah.
I can do three. Is three okay? It's about the history of the.
Give it a shot, and then I'll tell you my one word. You give it three.
For me, it's the history of the sperm bank.
That's what it's about, but more dynamically, the process. What is it that you're addressing here? Something that's happened over time.
Something that has happened over time.
Yeah, and what's the problem that you're addressing that you're hoping to reverse?
The problem I am addressing, but again, it's way too long if I say it, but is that a lot of the times the way the sperm bank used to work is being criticized. It's giving rise to controversy because people criticize the anonymity and the secrecy surrounding it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
so let me cut you off right there because here's my one word answer is right there. Yeah.
Secrecy. Yeah. Does
that work for you?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah. If you really at the core of this whole thing, all these words that you've got at the core of it all, it's really mostly about this thing. If you were to give a presentation to a group, a really great way to start the presentation is by not talking about sperm banks and things like that, is to just begin by saying, I'm here to talk to you today about secrecy. And, you know, there's a good side to secrecy. It provides privacy and things like that. But there's also a really bad side to secrecy, which is it can cause this and this and this. And these are things we don't want to have happen. You could sit there and talk about secrecy for 5 minutes before we even start to get into the content of what you're here to talk about, you know, and the audience will all relate to secrecy. They may or may not relate to sperm banks. Some of them like, oh, God, that never has interested me. You know, you've whittled it down into a specific topic. But secrecy is something that's very broad and is more of a human dynamic and the consequences of it. And that's what you're delving into here. And so that's your theme, basically. You're doing a whole book that's about secrecy. What's the problem? So the problem that you're addressing, we've kind of just said there, if I ask you in 5 words or less, the problem is, give me 5 words.
That we don't know anything because of the secrecy.
That's not 5. That was
I know. Yeah, I'm very bad at math.
That's all right. But this is the challenge, and this is a super important challenge. It may sound kind of brainless as I'm constantly pushing people, you know, boil this down to just a few words. But what happens when you boil it down to a few words is you weed out all the information and you're left with the story. You get to the bare elements of what's this a story about? This is a story about secrecy. So here's what I had. Secrecy is bad. You know, I know that's really crude. That doesn't tell us anything about the topic you're working on, but that's the problem, is that you're going to make the case to us that there's a bad side to secrecy. You know, there's some benefits to it, but there's all these bad.
I would say secrecy is a historical phenomenon. Today we regard secrecy as bad, but that's my view
okay.
from
Let's
the humanities.
let's keep going and dig deeper. And actually, this is the deeper dimension of it that you want to address here, which is what's at stake. Why does it matter? Why is secrecy an important variable? And what's at stake? What has it done for us? And that's what you really want to address in your narrative. And so I think you want to set up the one of the things we've learned with this course is that the longer we've worked on this, in the beginning, we thought ABTs were all about the red and the green. You know, we said to people, look, the and stuff can get boring. You want to get through that blue as quick as you can and get to the red and the green, because we're all here to know what's the problem and how are we going to fix it. Well, over time, we've slowly come to realize, wait a second, it's the blue material is the most important. That's the most challenging. It's how you set something up will make all the difference of whether we're interested in it or not. And if you just jump right to the problem, like why should we care? What's going on here? Who cares about sperm banks? In the blue material is where you tell us what a sperm bank is and why it's such an important thing. And that's where you set up what's at stake. And here's how many people over the years have had their lives damaged because of this secrecy element. And their lives would have been better had there been transparency. That might be a word for you to use. So here's my shot at it, and then push back exactly on this, and let's haggle a little bit, because this is what you do with the working circle group. Here's my draft. When it comes to public health, transparency is important. And if we can maintain transparency, then there will be great public trust, and we'll reap all these benefits from being transparent, yada, yada, yada. But when it comes to sperm bank, there's always been secrecy, and this has resulted in yada, 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 yada. The dark side of the bad side of the consequences, why you think this is an important issue. And therefore, to try and help address this problem, I'm going to do this book about the history of it. But the key point is it's this if-then tool, and it's not making the assumption, well, everybody knows that secrecy is a bad thing, or everybody knows that sperm banks cared by this. You want to articulate those things in a way that don't bore people, but make them understand, like, oh God, I didn't realize that there's this consequence of secrecy, or who knows what. So it's the if-then tool that's very, very powerful. I'd encourage all of you to kind of have that present in your mind when you're trying to make arguments. Put yourself in the other person's position, think about what you're saying, and ask whether or not it really is that compelling. And sometimes you need to kind of pinpoint it more specifically. Did you want to push back on some of the stuff I've written here? Because that's how you slowly evolve these things. Somebody gives you a shot like this, and you say, that's nice, but it's not quite right. But what really is right is this.
I like the focus on secrecy, but I think the transparency and public health part might not really speak to my discipline. Because that's something that would appeal to like a medical audience, but maybe not. So I have to think about
no,
this.
exactly. And I think that what I've done is point to a few things that I didn't know how to solve them, and you're not ready to solve them yet. This is why you need to become a surfer and go out and sit on your surfboard for hours and think this stuff through, because it's the thinking part that is so crucial. And now you start to see the consequences of a society that's running so fast where nobody can think straight. And this is what you see endlessly. I've given up trying to work with politicians, because in America, as soon as somebody declares a political campaign, they're already running so damn fast they cannot stop and think through the ABT of what they're saying. And you end up with all these garbage campaigns. Sadly, the next to last presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton ran a campaign that didn't have a narrative to it. They did not have time to think it through. And so they're just out there as, we're for this and this and this and this and this. People need to figure out, how does this all wrap together into the single overarching problem you're addressing? And on that note, we've got 5 minutes remaining. Well, the last little thing I want to say is, so there's the basic template, and but therefore what we get endlessly is people say, okay, got the 3 words, I'm all set, I'm all done. No, actually, look at all the stuff that gets added onto it. These are all it's a framework on which you hang all these different dynamics that you need the 10 hours to go through all of how these things work within it. But at the core of it, the goal is to try and help everybody develop this narrative intuition. And what that leads to is, it's deeper than the 3 words. It's these 3 forces: agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And those track right back to those philosophers in the 1600s. That's what they had identified way back then. This is how the brain works. We begin with agreement. This is the setup. then we hit the contradiction, the disagreement, and then we lead to what does that lead to in consequence. So that is a rapid fire sample of the basics. Got a question for me?
Yes, I'll start with a question myself, and then I might open the floor to other people with a question. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat, then I can turn you into a panelist so you can take the floor.
Okay, and by the way, I've only got 2 hours available right now to keep talking, so you shut me off whenever you want. Okay.
Yeah,
keep going.
I wanted to ask a question about character, basically. Because you urge scientists to put their research into this ABT framework to reduce it to the core narrative. And I get this. And actually, it reminds me of a log line. A log line in film,
Yes.
you know, a log line that is a sentence, a one summary of a film or a TV show, which mostly mentions the central conflict of the story, but also the main character and how he will handle or solve the main conflict. So if I mean, you talked about the Wizards of Oz, this has a main character, and this character does something. But in the ABT examples now, the characters were quite abstract phenomena. So we had as a character a spawning location and secrecy. And I just wonder, how do you handle this kind of complex phenomena as characters? And do you think characters are important for researchers who want to tell a scientific story?
You're actually bringing up something that maybe I should give some thought to. I've gotten fond of that term main character that I used at the beginning. And what I mean by that is the overarching, what's the whole idea of what it's about? But I don't mean in terms of who is the main character or anything like that. And so that's maybe causing a little confusion because you've worked with that, I think, in filmmaking and things like that, developing stories. But the key point is to figure out what's the theme. And you know what, I maybe should just say what's the theme. Do you want to take another shot at that question?
So do you think in order, because I think your ABT framework really allows for people to explain things clearly. But I think to explain something clearly is the first
you're
step.
Telling me an ABT right now.
Yeah.
but said but.
I think in order to, it's the first step. Yeah. But you also need to be able to appeal to an audience. Yes. And therefore, I think you might need characters in a traditional sense.
Yes. Think back to the little leopard seal story I ran through there, and how I divided that into content versus form. And so character is content. And that's why I say, you know, I can't mess with your content, you know, your area of expertise, your information. And to some extent that will determine your audience, because an awful lot of audiences are driven by content in the short term. But it's that structure of the form that enables you to take this really cool information and make a difference of whether or not people get it at a deep level. For example, here's just off the top of my head, the movie Jurassic Park came along in 1993. I grew up with all kinds of toy dinosaurs. I thought they were cool and awesome. Everybody, you know, from day one, always thought dinosaurs were cool, but they were there at a certain level of popularity. Suddenly, this movie, through the power of a really well-structured, well-told story, which one of the things we do in the course, I go through the breakdown of it to show you that it's absolute classic art plot, classical design going all the way back to 4,000 years ago. The principles that have evolved over time, over evolutionary time and in the cultural evolution, that it was by presenting it in the form of a story like that had that perfect form, that the same character that had been there all along, that was not so popular, suddenly jumped to a much larger audience and broke through. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, it does, actually. So
yeah, I mean, it's very complicated, because one of the things I cite in my first book, quote from our silent cinema course we had in film school, one of the papers they had us read was by Rex Ingram, one of the first big epic film directors back in the silent movie era. And he said 9 times out of 10, it is character that people remember rather than plot for movies. Yeah. So that's the truth. You know, all these years later, you remember Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. You remember that character and her traits and things like that. You don't remember story points and things like that so much, but you're not going to remember her very well if it wasn't delivered to you with these elements of attending to setup, problem, and solution. And so that's the yin and the yang of the whole thing. You don't get one without the other. Character by itself just doesn't work very well. Or if it does stay with people, it doesn't stay with a clear function. And this is the fundamental divide also to keep in mind, which is what are you involved with? Are you involved with art, or are you involved with strategic communication? And if all you're involved with is art, if all you want to do is make films that stimulate people and get them all excited in the theater, and if you don't care if they go home and they got a completely different story out of your movie than what you thought, or out of your presentation or anything like that, that's what artists love. You know, they paint a painting, they hang it on the wall, and they love people to come up, oh my God, that painting to me says this, oh, is this. But that's not, if you're a scientist, that's not the communication you're involved with. You're involved with strategic communication, which you know what the real story is out there in nature, and you want every single person in the audience to walk away with that same understanding. It's not about them. You know, I listened to your talk and what I got, you know, that's not what you want. We got a question.
Yeah, we got another question. Let's see. Because I just added Amy as a panelist, so you can also ask your question in person, which makes it a bit more
fun.
A bit more fun. Yeah.
Hello,
Hi.
Amy.
Hello.
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 Thank you so much for an excellent talk. My question was really whether or not there was benefit to reordering the structure of your if, but, and therefore sometimes, if it can be turned on its head, and if that can be used for sort of impactful reversal.
When you start to do that, you enter into this divide between kind of strategic communication and art, basically. So art audiences want you to do that, and they want you to take the formula and mess with it, and they want their brains to be stimulated. And so, for example, and this is coming really deep out of Hollywood, but one of the great, maybe the greatest book ever written, I think, for screenwriting is Robert McKee's book just titled Story. And in there, he talks about these two fundamental structures, which he labels as arc plot. Arc plot is classical design. It's all these stories that radiate around the world. It's Star Wars. It's everything like that lasts forever. It's the Greek myths and everything over time. And that's arc plot. And at the opposite of that is what he calls mini plot. And that's art movies and things like that. And it's doing exactly what you said. And he goes through 8 characteristics. I plucked out the 5 that I think are most relevant to the science world. And those characteristics are one main character, one single protagonist. That character is active in the world, fighting for things. Everything is told in linear timeline, one event after another, after another, after another. Everything makes sense. We get an answer to everything. We find out who the murderer was, all that sort of stuff. And then the 5th thing is that it all comes together at the end with a closed ending where every question is answered, and you can go walk out of the theater happy and whatever, read the book. And even in a science talk, you know, every question was posed at the beginning got addressed. And that's what the brain wants. And it's deeply programmed from thousands of years like that. Now, the art audience loves throwing that stuff on its head, and they love nonlinear timelines, you know, and you see lots of great movies that will begin with the last scene and then work backwards to it and jump all around in time. Quentin Tarantino's movies were really popular for that. He was kind of a master of that. And he actually was a master of managing to do a hybrid of enough art stuff to get respects from the art critics, and then broad enough to score a little bit of a mass audience. But that's the polar ends of the thing, is that as soon as you start messing with those arc plot elements, your audience size begins to decrease. So it's that thing about the one central character, the one thing. Luke Skywalker, you know, for Star Wars, and Dorothy for The Wizard of Oz, and on and on and on. All these epic movies that reach across cultures and last over time, they've all got that one character, first off. And second off, that character is actively trying to solve a problem, is fighting something in the world. Art movies break all those rules. They can have 4 main characters, in which they're not doing anything. They're all just sitting around being kicked around by the world and saying, oh, isn't life grim or whatever. And art crowds will like that. But it's that fundamental divide of what are you trying to do here? And if you're trying to do strategic communications that is going to change the world, if you're trying to educate everybody on your problem, with migrating eels, then you don't want people to get creative and walk away with a different interpretation. Is that making some sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So for classic science communication, where you're really trying to convey the idea, then you're better off sticking with the classical narrative.
That's it. I mean, it's just how it works. And it's really frustrating, humility, and it stamps out creativity at times. And so you kind of have to have this little battle to retain some creativity. But all else equal, you just don't want people getting lost. And it's that thing I told about the climate deal with John Sturman. 84% of these really smart graduate students, all the facts were accurate. All the content was accurate in that summary for policymakers. And yet they got the overall message wrong because it was presented in a way that just didn't work. So that's really bad news. And you hear these scientists, we got to get all the facts right. Yes, but you can have your accurate facts give the wrong story if you put it together the wrong way. What good is that? Yeah, you made sure everything was accurate, but you crammed so much in there, people got lost and they walked away with the wrong message. So that's the trade-off.
Yeah.
So cool.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. And
thanks for your question, Amy. And Story by Robert McKee is a really good book. I've also read it and it's very useful.
you know what? It sat on my bookshelf for 10 years. I bought it in 97 when I finished film school. Honest to God, I did not crack it open until I started writing my book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. And one night I sat down and I said, I wonder what this guy says in his book. And that's when I came across that arc plot, mini plot thing, which I not only put it in my first book, but then in the Houston book, 6 years later, I put it in, and the title of that section was Backed by Unpopular Demand, because no one ever wrote to me about it. No one ever got it. Most people don't get McKee's triangle. It's called, that's his thing about arc plot, mini plot, and anti-plot. And it's over the heads of the vast majority of people. This stuff is really, really tough, but it's important and powerful when you get it. Another question.
Yeah. So we got another question by Pietrian. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
You're filing a complaint about my critique of your ABT.
Yeah. No. Yeah, well, I was just thinking it's a very, very useful concept. While following the question of Amy, actually, I was thinking, is there actually a method to integrate it in the more classical scientific presentations, or replacing? Well, basically, what I want to say is, when you, for instance, go to a conference and you see various presentations day after day, you get really, well, it can sometimes be exhausting to keep your focus for those days, seeing all these talks. So what would you think about that? How can a talk be more standing out, and can it be done by applying the ABT to a more classical?
Yeah. So, lots of thoughts on that. The starting point is Jerry Graff is a professor in the humanities world at University of Illinois, Chicago. He's in his 80s now, he's retired. But this is a book that he published, he and his wife, and this book has sold over 2 million copies. It's used in college courses across America. They say, I say. And what it is the use of templates for argumentation, for debating. And so there's a whole big section at the end of it. They give you all these different, like 25 templates for how to put together a compelling argument. But they've titled it with, and he's a good buddy of mine, for 15 years, he was in my movie, Flock of Dodos. And they titled this, They Say, I Say, because that's the simplest of argument. If you're sitting there in a room and you want to put forth an argument, the way you want to do it is begin with, start off, don't just say, I disagree, blah, blah, blah. You begin by setting up the context by, here's what they say. Traditionally, everybody thinks this, and this, this is what we can all agree on is the standard knowledge, but here's what I say. And this is different, therefore. And so I've ended up explaining to him, that's the and the but, the title of his whole book. And they just didn't include the therefore. So, they say is the and the agreement. I say is the contradiction. But I say, and then therefore, where are we going with this? How are we going to resolve these two things? That's how primal this is. And he didn't even know it. They titled their book that. But the more you absorb this three-part structure, again, it goes back to those guys in the 1600s. They figured it out. This is the tragedy of our society today. Once upon a time, we had this knowledge. We allowed this information to go crazy. And now we're sitting here in this morass of just lunacy. And the only hope, I think, for the long term is to reach back to those core principles. When people had clear brains, they saw that three-part structure. And as a result, that's the first thing to say to you, start looking for it in the world around you. You won't believe where you see it every single place. Just this morning, I had a conference call and a guy got on and said, hey, I'm a musician. I looked at one of my most popular songs, and guess what? It's all ABT structured. It's there in the verses. It's really, really common. That's the way we present this stuff. But let me talk about the key word, but. And this word is so damn deep. And the reason I mentioned Jerry Graff is that last spring, he sent me an email one Sunday afternoon, and he said, I was reading an editorial this morning in the New York Times, and I was thinking about your ABT, and is it not the case that this word but is probably the single most powerful word in the entire English language? And my answer to him is that's exactly what I saw when I visited the neurophysiologist at Princeton, Yuri Hassan, where I told him about the ABT, and he said, come over here. And he showed me this work they were doing, putting people in the MRI machine and having them just listen to stories where they can look at the text of what they're being told and look at brain activity. And lo and behold, on the word but, you see the brain. As soon as you say but, and think about that, you cannot end a sentence with the word but. You can't end a paragraph with the word but. Why? Because as soon as you say but, everybody like, yeah, but what? But what's next? And as a result, one of my best friends is one of the world's top experts on medical marijuana, and he's got a super popular book. And he told me recently that he said, nowadays, your ABT thing is so powerful that when I'm doing a press conference or when I'm doing Q&A like this right now, and he said, if I find that I'm losing my way, all I have to do is just throw out that word but, and the whole audience will look up from their iPhones like, but what? And then, then I got to figure out what I'm going to follow with. But that word is so damn powerful. And the moral of that whole story for you is that, as you're saying, if you want your presentation to be powerful, get to the but as quickly as you can. Don't go right to it. You got to attend to that blue stuff, but very quickly. Don't get caught. This is what scientists do. This is the bane of scientists. And I did it myself, which is, and so, eels are these incredible things, and they, you find them here and you find them there and you find them there. And they're like, well, I know, but what's the problem? No, wait, no, I'm not getting to the problem yet. You need to know that eels have been studied for all these years. And there's all these books on it. I know, but what's the problem? Hang on. You're not going to be able to understand the problem unless I tell you all this other stuff. This is what scientists do. And you actually didn't need all that other stuff. You just needed a couple of key details to put it into context. And then let's get to the damn problem. And then what you do is all that other stuff, you backload it. Once we've activated your brain with the but, now you're listening. And therefore, now you can start to weave in more of that exposition, all that information about eels and everything downstream. But if you string things out for 5 minutes and you still haven't gotten, this is what happens all the time, still haven't gotten to the but, what is the problem? What are we here to talk about? And towards that end, that's why I say that little thing about, think about, like, for example, secrecy. And you're going to give a talk to a big audience. Instead of starting off with a whole story about the history of sperm banks, you start off with secrecy is a really great thing and it can guarantee privacy, but there's an unfortunate side to secrecy. Therefore, that's what I'm going to talk to you about today in a specific context of that. But giving people that opening little bit as a roadmap, what that does is they've got it instantly. They now know what your whole presentation is about. Okay, we're going to talk about the downside, blah, blah, blah. And that's where it's super duper powerful. And one of the people that teaches our course, Patricia Limerick, the author of this incredible book called The Legacy of Conquest from 1987, still one of the most popular books in American history. She's a MacArthur Fellow. She was the founder of the Center for the American West at University of Colorado. And she's one of the 5 main instructors in there. And she's from the history world. That's why I bring her in a completely different discipline. But she tells the story about 2016. I visited her, gave a talk to her history department at University of Colorado about the ABT, and then left and didn't talk to her for probably a year, I guess. What she never told me was that she sat there imprinting on the ABT. And a month later, she gave a keynote address to 500 historians. And the very first slide of her presentation, she said, I'm just going to try this experiment. She wrote an ABT on the slide of what the entire hour talk was going to be about. And she said, I've never done this before, but here's my first slide. And then she turned back the audience and read the end, it's about the progressive era and blah, blah, blah. And then she said she finished and turned back and the whole audience was riveted and like, yeah, are we done? Because we just got your whole story in one slide. And, can we break and go to lunch right now? Or we'll be good sports and listen for the next hour. But, all you're going to do now is fill in the details. And she said people came up to her at the reception and said, I've had decades of sitting through talks. I've never heard a talk open with such clarity that we knew exactly what you're going to talk about. And that's what you want, is to sketch out the roadmap of where you're going to take everybody so that they're not sitting there as you go along. What's he going to get? Why is he telling us all this? What's the point? What's the main thing? If you can give them that little, it's just like in a paper, giving them the abstract at the beginning, so you know what you're getting into, then you get into the details. Any of that make any sense?
Yeah, well, it sounds very familiar. But then as you give this, let's say this summary on everything, well, as the but comes quite in the beginning, do you think you need to have like how would I call it, a subsection but or something to keep the audience their interest?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
for a longer talk.
This becomes the deeper dimensions of it. And I mentioned a little bit in the Houston book. The term that I coined for it is nested ABTs. So what you want is you've got your overarching ABT that you're laying out there at the beginning about secrecy. Secrecy is a great, wonderful thing, and we like it for privacy, but it's got this dark side. Therefore, I'm going to give you a presentation here about implied in this specific context of sperm banks. Then you start in and you've got, okay, let me tell you about the story about the very first sperm bank ever created. They did this and they did this, but they forgot to do this. And as a result of that, this is what happened. So now there's a little ABT within there, and you're making the point about how far back so it's all within this thing. And the key thing is that this is not something ultimately that you can do well using the formula. The working with the ABT begins to strengthen your narrative intuition. That's the term we've got. And eventually you get good at that. And then you just naturally start talking ABT. And there's probably only so much that you can do on that. There are people that are born, I think, with ABT programmed in their brain. As kids, they're already telling good stories and things like that. And there are other people that are born with and their brain. They don't know how to bend a story. They just keep going on and on and on and on. So I think there's a genetic component, probably 2/3, and then there's maybe 1/3 environmental. One of the things I like to tell people is that I went to film school at age 38. I'd already programmed my brain as a scientist. My developmental years for the development of my brain were over with, till age 25. And so all those neurons were fixed. And I think that limited my ability to become better at story. I entered into a class with all 21-year-olds. I was 38. And they weren't done developing their brains. And 20 years later, I'd end up at cocktail parties with those folks. And some of them who developed careers as screenwriters, when we were in film school, they could not tell a story to save their souls. I had these rotten writing classes. You'd sit there and the person would go on, and then the character does this, and then this happens, and then this happens, then this happens. But incubating their brains in Hollywood for 20 years, especially starting in their early 20s, 20 years later, I ran into the cocktail party. Hey, what have you been up to? Well, I got this script at Paramount. It's kind of a cross between Die Hard meets, Speed. And there's like this and that. And then they bang, bang, bang. They can tell you story, and pull you in. And that's 20 years of incubating their brain in the narrative world, which just proves that everybody, it's worth going to work. It's not clear that you could become a master at this stuff, but you can definitely even later in life. And for me, I'm so much better at it now than I was 25 years ago when I departed my academic career and didn't know the first damn thing on telling structure and stories. And one of the things that happens with me is that there's another we could do a lecture on this, the but to and ratio. But in a document, that becomes the fingerprint of how much narrative content you've got in there. In something that's got strong narrative, you're going to find a high ratio of buts to ands. And in something that's really boring, it's going to be hardly any buts and just and. You can quantify that. And that's what I do nowadays with documents a lot. And it turns out my books and everything I've ever written, because I'm really argumentative, everything has got a fairly high ratio of buts to ands. I've always got a lot of buts in there. And I don't do it by thinking, okay, now it's time for a but. I just spew this stuff out. I write these things. And sometimes after it's even been published, I'll go, hey, I wonder what the but to and ratio, oh, there it is. Always really high. So that's what you begin to work your way into. is that mode of thinking. And, you know, I hate to say it's argumentation, but it kind of is basically. It's setting up this world and then hitting the contradiction and then taking into the consequence.
Andy, may I ask you one final question
Yes,
before
yes.
we close off here?
Wrap it up.
It's getting late in
Yes,
Belgium.
I
One final question, which is a question out of curiosity, and I guess a lot of people here wonder, why did you switch careers?
I think story is probably the unifying element, which was what drew me into science more than science was the individuals I met who were great storytellers. And the stories they told me, these marine biologists, were absolutely hypnotic. I think I enjoyed that more than anything else on the one hand. On the other hand, I enjoy the logical structure of science, which is developing an idea and then going out there and testing it and all this sorts of stuff. And when I began to get deeper into the science world, and I found that I enjoyed communication and began to think a little bit analytically about it, that appealed to me. And so when I finally left and went to film school, what I saw was the same basic thing. One of the things I mentioned at the beginning of that Don't Be Such a Scientist book is that film and science are the same basic process. In science, you go out into the world, you gather data, you come back into the lab, and then you smash it down into a paper that you then share with an audience. In film, you go out in the world, you shoot film, you bring it into the editing suite, you smash it down into something which you then share with an audience. And so for me, the two careers have always been very, very similar. I think in part because of this ABT thing. I see the core dynamic of ABT. I don't see the professions as all that different. In 1959, there's that famous essay from C.P. Snow about the two cultures. And I think sadly, that was a failure for him to look down at this core level and see that they're not that different. It's all this three-part structure. And the final thing I'll say on that is one of the most important books in human culture is Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And there's a quote in there in the first chapter that I use all the time in the course, in which he, you know, what Joseph Campbell did was he set out traveling around the world, looking at storytelling and all the different cultures and religions. And he posed a simple little question, the same type of question evolutionist poses, which is, are all these cultures telling stories completely differently, in which we need to come up with a whole bunch of classifications for how stories are told, or is there a commonality? And in the first chapter is this one line where he says, there are, of course, many, many differences in how different cultures and stories tell their stories. But this isn't a book about differences. This is a book about similarities. And it's through similarities that we learn how the world works. And that's what he eventually found was everybody's telling the same basic story. Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's the monomyth. And his analytical mind was able to boil that all down into that singular stem of three-part structure, basically. And I think that's the way I've always approached the world. And that's why, for me, jumping from the science career to the filmmaking career was never that big of a jump. And I just wish that our society could look at it that way, instead of all these people who are so focused on content and just think, well, I have nothing in common with those people. You know, they don't understand my world. And we run into that with our training stuff every once in a while. You'll find somebody who just doesn't get the form thing. And because you don't know their content, they think you can't help them at all.
Yeah. So in your view, science and film are not so different. Because narrative is everything.
ABT. Did I mention that narrative is everything?
So thanks very much for your talk, which was really inspiring, and also thanks for showing your library and sharing that with us. So have a good day there in LA, and we'll wrap it up here.
And send me an email with any questions that we didn't get to or whatever, any other thoughts like that. And good luck with everything. And thanks. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.
Okay.